At 0447 on the morning of May 11, 1945, Private John McKinney lay in his tent near Dingalan Bay, Luzon, unaware that approximately 100 Japanese soldiers were creeping through the jungle toward his position. 24 years old, 2.5 years in the Army, a sharecropper's son from Georgia with a third-grade education. By May 1945, the Philippine campaign had already cost the United States over 60,000 casualties. Japanese forces on Luzon refused to surrender. They launched night attacks, dawn raids, suicide charges against American perimeters. Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment, 33rd Infantry Division, had established an outpost near Dingalan Bay in Tayabas Province. The position guarded a crucial supply route. 3 Americans manned a light machine gun on the perimeter. McKinney had just finished a long shift at that gun. He walked a few paces to his tent, laid down with his M1 rifle beside him. The jungle was quiet. The Japanese knew this outpost existed. They had been watching it for days, counting the Americans, timing the guard rotations, planning their assault. The attack force moved through the darkness, over 100 soldiers from remnants of Japanese units still fighting on Luzon. They carried rifles, grenades, knee mortars, and swords. Their objective was simple: overrun the American position, kill everyone, capture the supplies. The vanguard slipped past the outer guard post undetected. Sergeant Fukutaro Mori led the advance element. His orders were to eliminate the first Americans silently. No gunfire, swords and bayonets only. By the time the main force attacked, the perimeter would already be compromised. Mori reached McKinney's tent. He could hear the American breathing inside. One quick strike would end this man's life before he could raise an alarm. In the next 40 minutes, one Georgia farm boy with a rifle would kill 41 Japanese soldiers and save his entire company from annihilation. This is the story of the sharecropper's son who learned to hunt before he learned to read. How he survived a sword strike that should have killed him. How he fought with his rifle until the ammunition ran out, then fought with his hands. How the United States Army initially didn't believe what he had done was even possible, and how the quiet farm boy from Georgia became one of the most lethal individual soldiers in American military history. John Robert McKinney was born May 1, 1920, in Woodcliff, Georgia, Screven County, Deep South, cotton country. His father, Robert McKinney, was a sharecropper, not a farmer, not a landowner, a sharecropper. That distinction mattered in Depression-era Georgia. It meant the family worked land they didn't own for a share of the crop. When the harvest was good, they ate. When it wasn't, they didn't. The McKinney family lived in a 2-room shack on the edge of someone else's property. No electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing, no money for anything beyond bare survival. John was the youngest of 7 children, 5 brothers, 2 sisters. The older siblings helped in the fields as soon as they could walk. John followed the same path. By age 6, he was picking cotton alongside his parents. By age 8, he was working a full day. 12 hours under the Georgia sun, bent over cotton plants, filling a sack that weighed more than he did. School was something that happened when the fields didn't need working, which wasn't often. John attended the local schoolhouse sporadically, a week here, a few days there. The teacher understood. Most of the children in Screven County came from sharecropping families. Education was a luxury they couldn't afford. By 3rd grade, John stopped going altogether. He could read a little, write his name in crude letters, do basic arithmetic, count money he'd never have. That was enough for a sharecropper's son. His father never pushed him to continue. Robert McKinney knew his son's future. Work the land, marry young, raise children who would work the land, die owing money to the landowner. That was the cycle. That was life in Screven County in the 1920s and 1930s. But John could hunt. His father taught him to shoot when he was 8 years old, an old Stevens .22 rifle, single shot, bolt action. The barrel was worn smooth from decades of use. The stock had been repaired with wire so many times it looked like it would fall apart, but it shot straight. Robert McKinney couldn't afford to waste ammunition on practice. Bullets cost money the family didn't have, so every shot had to count. He took John into the woods behind their shack, showed him how to hold the rifle, how to aim, how to control his breathing, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. Then he gave John 3 bullets and told him to bring back 3 squirrels. John missed all 3 shots that first day. His father didn't criticize him, didn't yell, just looked at him and said, "Tomorrow I'll give you 2 bullets. Make them count." John learned fast. He had to. Missing meant the family didn't eat meat. Missing meant disappointing his father. Missing meant going to bed hungry while your siblings looked at you with hollow eyes. By age 10, John rarely missed. By 12, he could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with iron sights. By 15, he was providing most of the meat for the family table. Rabbits in the winter, deer when he could get close enough, wild turkey if he got lucky, possum and raccoon when nothing else was available. He learned to trap, set snares along game trails, check them before dawn, bring home whatever he caught. He fished in the creeks around Woodcliff, used worms he dug up himself, made hooks from bent nails, caught catfish and bream and anything else that would bite. The McKinney family survived because John could shoot. He became the provider before he became a man. The Depression hit Screven County hard, harder than most places. Cotton prices collapsed. Landowners couldn't pay sharecroppers. Families scattered. Some moved north looking for factory work. Others just disappeared into the Georgia woods. The McKinneys stayed. They had nowhere else to go. John's older brothers left one by one, joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, found work in Savannah, got married and moved away. By 1940, John was one of 3 children still at home. His father's health was failing. The work fell increasingly on John. He was 20 years old, still couldn't read beyond a 3rd grade level, still worked land that would never be his, still hunted to keep his family fed. Then, December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor changed everything, changed the country, changed the war, changed John McKinney's life. The draft started immediately. Young men across America received their notices, report for induction, report for service. John didn't wait for the draft. He walked into the recruitment office at Fort McPherson in November 1942. 22 years old, 6 feet tall, 160 pounds, lean as a pine board from a lifetime of hard work and sparse meals. The recruiter looked at him. "Can you read and write, son?" "A little," John said. "How much is a little?" "3rd grade." The recruiter hesitated. The Army had standards, educational standards. They needed men who could read orders, follow technical manuals, understand complex instructions, but they also needed soldiers, millions of them. And this skinny Georgia kid looked like he could handle himself. "Can you shoot?" the recruiter asked. "Yes, sir," John said. "Been shooting since I was 8. "How good?" John didn't boast. He never boasted. He just stated facts. "Good enough to keep my family fed for 14 years. The recruiter signed him up. John McKinney became Private John R. McKinney, United States Army, on November 21, 1942. He shipped to basic training at Camp Blanding, Florida. The Army processed thousands of recruits through Blanding, farm boys and city kids, college graduates and men who'd never seen the inside of a classroom. The drill instructors treated them all the same, like dirt. McKinney didn't mind. He'd spent his entire life being treated like he didn't matter. The Army wasn't any worse than sharecropping. He excelled at some things. Physical training was easy. He'd been doing hard labor since childhood, marching with a full pack. That was easier than 12 hours in a cotton field. Navigation through woods. He'd been doing that since he could walk. Hand-to-hand combat. He'd been in enough fights growing up poor in rural Georgia. But other things were harder. Classes on tactics, military theory, reading technical manuals, understanding radio procedures. McKinney struggled. He'd sit in the classroom while the instructor talked about flanking movements and fire support and all these concepts that required reading and comprehension. He couldn't follow it. The words on the chalkboard meant nothing. He'd copy them into his notebook, but he couldn't read them back later. Other soldiers noticed. Some mocked him, called him stupid, called him a hick. McKinney didn't respond. He'd been called worse. He just kept doing what he could do, and what he could do better than anyone else in his entire battalion was shoot. The Army's rifle qualification course used the M1 Garand, semi-automatic, 8-round internal magazine. 30-06 Springfield cartridge, standard infantry weapon, targets at 100, 200, and 300 yards, 40 rounds, positions from prone, kneeling, and standing, Maximum score, 250 points. Sharpshooter qualification, 210 to 219 points. Expert qualification, 220 plus points. McKinney scored 246 out of 250. The range officer thought there was a mistake. Checked the targets again. No mistake. This barely literate farm boy from Georgia had just outshot every soldier in the battalion. The drill sergeant started paying attention. They moved him to advanced marksmanship training, gave him additional ammunition, let him practice. McKinney didn't need the practice. He'd been practicing since he was 8 years old. Every squirrel he'd shot with his father's .22, every deer he'd dropped with a borrowed hunting rifle, every meal he'd provided for his family. That was practice. That was preparation. The Army was just giving him a better weapon. The sergeants noticed something else too. McKinney moved differently than other soldiers. When they ran land navigation exercises through the Florida woods, most soldiers crashed through the brush, made noise, got lost. McKinney glided through the forest like smoke. Quiet, aware, always knowing exactly where he was. He'd spent his entire life hunting. You don't catch rabbits by announcing your presence. You move quiet, you watch, you listen. The skills that had kept his family fed were the same skills that made him a perfect infantry soldier. By the time basic training ended, the drill sergeants had figured out what they had. McKinney couldn't read a technical manual to save his life, but put him in the woods with a rifle, and he was the most dangerous man in the company. They assigned him to the 33rd Infantry Division, the Prairie Division, Illinois National Guard unit that had been federalized for the war. McKinney didn't care about the division's history or lineage. He cared about doing his job, staying alive, maybe helping end the war so he could go home. The 33rd deployed to the Pacific in 1943. They shipped from San Francisco to Hawaii, then to New Guinea. New Guinea was hell. Jungle so thick you couldn't see 20 feet, heat that made men collapse from exhaustion, humidity that rotted your boots while you were still wearing them. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever. Japanese snipers, landmines, crocodiles in the rivers. The 33rd Infantry Division fought through it all. They engaged Japanese forces at Finschhafen, Sidor, along the northern coast of New Guinea. McKinney saw his first combat at Sidor in January 1944. His platoon was advancing through jungle when Japanese soldiers opened fire from concealed positions. McKinney's sergeant went down in the first burst. 2 other soldiers were hit before anyone could react. McKinney dropped prone, identified the muzzle flashes, 3 Japanese soldiers firing from behind a fallen log 80 yards away. He aimed, fired 3 times, 3 shots, 3 kills. The Japanese position went silent. His lieutenant crawled over. "Good shooting, Private." McKinney reloaded, said nothing. This was just hunting. Different prey. Same principle. The 33rd fought through New Guinea for 14 months. They lost men to combat, lost more to disease. Malaria hit everyone eventually. McKinney got it in June 1944, spent 2 weeks in a field hospital shaking with fever. When he recovered, they sent him back to his unit. By early 1945, the 33rd was preparing for the Philippines, the liberation of Luzon, MacArthur's return. The division landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 31, 1945. They fought south toward Manila, heavy combat, urban fighting. The Japanese contested every street, every building. McKinney's company was part of the advance. They cleared Japanese positions, secured supply routes, pushed deeper into Luzon. By May 1945, the main fighting for Manila was over, but Japanese forces scattered across Luzon refused to surrender. They formed into groups, launched guerrilla attacks against American positions. The 33rd Infantry was assigned to secure the eastern coast of Luzon, protect supply routes, prevent Japanese forces from interfering with American operations. Company A established an outpost near Dingalan Bay in Tayabas Province. Remote location, dense jungle, perfect spot for Japanese forces to attack. The company set up defensive positions, dug foxholes, placed machine guns to cover the approaches. 3 soldiers manned a light .30 caliber machine gun on the perimeter. They worked in shifts, 6 hours on, 6 hours off. McKinney took his turn at the gun. He'd been on shift since midnight. By 04:30, he was exhausted. His replacement arrived at 04:40. McKinney briefed him, showed him the fields of fire, told him where the ammunition was stored. Then he walked to his tent. 10 yards from the machine gun position, he laid down with his M1 Garand beside him, always beside him. He had learned in New Guinea, never be separated from your weapon, not even to sleep. The jungle was quiet, the kind of quiet that should have been a warning. At 0447, Sergeant Fukutaro Mori reached McKinney's tent. Mori threw open the tent flap at 0451. The sword came down in a diagonal slash aimed at McKinney's neck. In the darkness, Mori misjudged the distance. The blade caught McKinney on the side of the head instead. It severed part of his right ear. Blood sprayed across the tent canvas. McKinney's eyes opened to searing pain and the silhouette of a man standing over him with a raised sword. He had less than 1 second to react. Mori was already bringing the blade down for a second strike. This one would not miss. McKinney's hand found his rifle in the darkness. He didn't aim. He didn't think. 24 years of survival instinct took over. He swung the M1 like a club. The rifle butt caught Mori under the chin with enough force to shatter bone. The crack was audible even over the screaming that had started outside. The Japanese sergeant staggered backward. His sword fell from his hands. McKinney swung again. The second blow caught Mori in the temple, crushed his skull. The sergeant collapsed. The machine gun position was 30 yards from his tent, the position he'd been manning 20 minutes ago. 3 Americans had replaced him there. Now he could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, shapes struggling, the distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles mixing with the heavier reports of M1 Garands. Japanese soldiers were pouring through the perimeter from the northeast. They moved in waves, professional, coordinated. This wasn't a random attack. The first wave had already reached the machine gun emplacement. McKinney could see figures struggling in the darkness around the gun pit. He saw 1 American soldier go down, saw another trying to drag him away. McKinney scrambled to his feet. Blood was running down the side of his face. The pain in his ear was intense, but pain was information. Pain meant he was alive. Outside the tent, he could hear them. Footsteps, dozens of footsteps moving fast through the camp. Rifle fire, the crack of grenades, screaming in English and Japanese. The main assault had begun. McKinney grabbed his rifle, checked the magazine, 8 rounds, grabbed his ammunition belt, 4 more 8-round clips, 48 rounds total counting what was in the rifle. He stepped out of the tent. What he saw made his blood run cold. His mind processed the tactical situation in seconds. Years of hunting had taught him to think fast, analyze the environment, identify threats, react. The machine gun was the key to the entire position. It covered the main approach to the American camp, interlocking fields of fire with other defensive positions. Any attack would have to deal with that gun first. If the Japanese captured it and turned it around, they could rake the entire perimeter with fire. Every American in Company A would die. McKinney ran toward the gun. He didn't think about the odds, didn't calculate that he was one man running toward an unknown number of enemy soldiers. He just ran. The 2 soldiers who had replaced him at the machine gun were fighting for their lives. Private James Hendricks had taken a bayonet wound to the shoulder in the first seconds of the attack. The wound was deep, bleeding badly. The 3rd man, seeing Hendricks go down, made a decision. He grabbed his wounded comrade under the arms and started dragging him toward the rear of the perimeter. It was the right call. Combat first aid doctrine was clear: get the wounded to safety. Hendricks would have bled out if left behind. But it meant the machine gun was now undefended. 10 Japanese infantrymen reached the emplacement before McKinney could get there. They swarmed over the sandbag wall, practiced movement. They'd done this before. One soldier immediately began trying to turn the gun around, grabbed the traversing mechanism, started pivoting the weapon to face the American positions. The others provided security. Rifles pointed outward, bayonets fixed, watching for any American counterattack. They expected the Americans to fall back, to regroup, to organize a response. They didn't expect one bleeding American to charge straight at them out of the darkness. McKinney didn't slow down. He didn't take cover. He didn't wait for backup. He sprinted directly at 10 enemy soldiers who had just captured the most important weapon in the entire outpost. One soldier immediately began trying to turn the gun around, grabbed the traversing mechanism, started pivoting the weapon to face the American positions. The others provided security. Rifles pointed outward, bayonets fixed, watching for any American counterattack. They expected the Americans to fall back, to regroup, to organize a response. They didn't expect one bleeding American to charge straight at them out of the darkness. McKinney didn't slow down. He didn't take cover. He didn't wait for backup. He sprinted directly at 10 enemy soldiers who had just captured the most important weapon in the entire outpost. The Japanese saw him coming. A single American, bleeding from a head wound, charging straight at them in the pre-dawn darkness. For a moment, they hesitated, trying to understand what they were seeing. Why wasn't this American retreating? Why was he alone? Was this a trap? That moment of hesitation cost them. 2 Japanese soldiers raised their rifles. McKinney was faster. He shot the first man at 15 yards, center mass. The M1's report echoed across the camp. The soldier dropped. He shot the second man at 12 yards, another clean shot. The soldier went down. McKinney was sprinting, closing distance, 10 yards, 8 yards, 5 yards. He fired twice more. 2 more Japanese soldiers fell. By the time he reached the sandbag wall, he had fired 4 rounds. 4 Japanese soldiers were down. 6 remained alive. McKinney leaped into the emplacement. The space inside was roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, designed for 3 American soldiers operating the machine gun. Now it held 7 men, 1 American, 6 Japanese. It was too confined for rifles. Some of the Japanese were trying to swing their weapons around. Others reached for bayonets. One was still fumbling with the machine gun's traversing mechanism. McKinney landed among them and kept firing. Point-blank range. The M1, Garand held 8 rounds in its internal magazine. He had already fired 4, getting to the position. He put the next 3 rounds into 3 more Japanese soldiers at distances measured in feet, not yards. 1 round left. The 8th Japanese soldier was directly in front of him. Young, maybe 20 years old. Bayonet raised for a thrust at McKinney's chest. McKinney fired his last round. The soldier dropped at his feet. The M1 Garand's bolt locked back on an empty magazine with its distinctive metallic ping. The en-bloc clip ejected automatically, fell to the floor of the gun pit. 3 Japanese soldiers were still alive. They had heard that sound. They knew what it meant. The American's rifle was empty. One of them smiled, raised his bayonet. McKinney didn't reload. No time. He reversed his grip on the rifle before the empty clip had finished falling. He swung the weapon like a baseball bat. The walnut stock connected with the first soldier's temple. The impact sounded like breaking pottery. The man's skull fractured. He collapsed without a sound. McKinney swung again. The second soldier tried to block with his forearm. His mistake. The rifle butt shattered both radius and ulna bones. The momentum continued through, caught the soldier on the side of the head. His neck snapped. He went down. The third soldier lunged with a bayonet. Professional thrust, aimed at McKinney's stomach. McKinney sidestepped, training from basic. The bayonet passed inches from his ribs. He brought the rifle down on the back of the man's neck. The vertebrae cracked audibly. The soldier fell face first into the dirt. 10 Japanese soldiers had captured the machine gun. Approximately 45 seconds later, all 10 were dead. McKinney stood in the gun pit, breathing hard, blood dripping from his severed ear, rifle in his hands. He grabbed a stripper clip from his ammunition belt, loaded 8 fresh rounds into the M1. The action was automatic. He'd done it thousands of times. Turned to face the jungle. More were coming. He could hear them. The second wave hit at 0453. 15 to 20 Japanese soldiers charging from the northeast. They had seen their comrades die at the machine gun. They were coming to avenge them. Professional soldiers don't charge blindly into defended positions. But these Japanese had seen 10 of their men take the gun. They thought the position was secured. They didn't know 1 American had just killed all 10. McKinney swung the .30 caliber machine gun around. The weapon was still loaded. The previous crew had been overrun before they could fire more than a few bursts. Full ammunition belt, maybe 200 rounds. He grabbed the spade grips, pressed the butterfly trigger. The gun hammered. Tracer rounds arced into the charging Japanese like a stream of fire. The muzzle flash lit up the pre-dawn darkness. The first 3 men went down in the initial burst. McKinney traversed left, caught 2 more soldiers in the open. They fell, the rest scattered, dove for cover, returned fire. Arisaka rifle rounds snapped past McKinney's head. One hit the sandbag next to him. Another ricocheted off the machine gun's receiver. He kept firing. Short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds. Professional suppressive fire. The Japanese were good. They weren't panicking. They were maneuvering, trying to flank the gun position. The machine gun's ammunition belt ran dry. McKinney didn't have time to reload it. More Japanese were coming from the right flank now. Multiple directions, coordinated attack. He grabbed his M1 and climbed out of the emplacement, moved 10 yards east. Found cover behind a fallen log. A Japanese soldier appeared 20 yards ahead, rising from cover to fire. McKinney shot him before he could pull the trigger. Another appeared. Another shot. Another kill. The M1 Garand was semi-automatic. 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger. McKinney's trigger finger had been trained on Georgia squirrels for 15 years. He could shoot faster than most men could aim. 5 more Japanese soldiers died in the next 20 seconds. McKinney, shooting, moving, shooting again. The M1 pinged empty again. McKinney dropped behind the log, reloaded. 3rd magazine since the fight started. The Japanese were adjusting tactics. They'd learned that charging the machine gun position meant death. Now, they were trying different approaches, using the jungle, moving in small groups, 2 or 3 men, using fire and movement, professional infantry tactics. McKinney saw movement 30 yards south, 2 Japanese soldiers low-crawling toward the American tents, trying to get behind the defensive line. He shot both, 1 round each. Both dropped, saw movement to the north. 1 soldier trying to flank wide, shot him. The light was improving now. Dawn was coming. McKinney could see better. That meant the Japanese could see him better too. A rifle shot cracked from the tree line. The bullet hit the log 6 inches from McKinney's head. Bark exploded. Splinters hit his face. Japanese sniper, somewhere in the trees. Good shot. Too good. McKinney rolled left, came up in a different position 5 feet away, scanned the trees, looking for the muzzle flash from the sniper's second shot. There. 50 yards. Up in a tree. The flash was brief but visible in the growing light. McKinney aimed, held his breath, squeezed. The sniper fell from his perch, hit the ground with a heavy thud. By 05:10, McKinney had killed 28 Japanese soldiers in 23 minutes. He was running low on ammunition. The M1 used .30-06 Springfield cartridges. Standard infantry load was 80 rounds in belts across the chest. McKinney had started the fight with approximately 48 rounds after his guard shift. He'd fired at least 40, maybe more. He'd stopped counting. He crawled back to the machine gun position, checked for spare M1 ammunition among the dead. Found 2 bandoliers on an American soldier who'd been killed in the initial attack. 48 more rounds, enough for 6 more magazines. The wounded Japanese soldier he'd hit with the rifle butt was still alive, unconscious but breathing. McKinney disarmed him, took his rifle, took his grenades, 3 Type 97 hand grenades, Japanese fragmentation grenades. McKinney had never used them before, but a grenade was a grenade. Pull the pin, count, throw, movement to the northeast, a full squad of Japanese soldiers forming up for another assault, 10 men. They were organized, professional. This wasn't a suicide charge. This was a coordinated infantry attack with fire support and bounding advance. McKinney pulled the pin on the first Type 97, counted to 2 like he'd been trained with American grenades, threw it. The grenade landed in the middle of the Japanese formation. The explosion was immediate and devastating. 3 soldiers went down, the rest scattered. McKinney shot 2 more while they were running, reloaded, shot another. The squad broke. The survivors fled back into the jungle. By 05:20, the fighting had been going for 33 minutes. McKinney had been in continuous combat for over half an hour. No water, no rest, no medical attention for his severed ear. Blood was soaking his uniform, his head was pounding, his hands were shaking from adrenaline, but he was still alive, still fighting, still protecting his company. The Japanese made one final push at 05:23. 20 soldiers, maybe more. It was hard to count in the chaos. They came from 3 directions simultaneously. Northeast, east, southeast, coordinated attack. This was their last attempt to overrun the American position. Everything they had left. McKinney was alone. The other Americans in Company A were scattered, fighting their own battles, holding their own sections of the perimeter. Nobody was coming to help him. The machine gun was out of ammunition. McKinney's M1 had 16 rounds left, 2 magazines, 16 rounds against approximately 20 men. He waited until they were close, 30 yards, 20, 15. Then he opened fire. The M1 barked, once, twice, 8 times in less than 4 seconds. 8 Japanese soldiers fell. McKinney ejected the empty clip. loaded his last magazine. 8 more rounds. The remaining Japanese soldiers kept coming. They were committed now. No retreat, no surrender, just the attack. McKinney shot 6 more before the M1 clicked empty on his last round. 6 Japanese soldiers were still advancing, 10 yards away now, then 5. McKinney had no ammunition, no grenades, no time to reload even if he had bullets. He had a rifle with an empty magazine and a broken stock from beating men to death. He reversed the rifle one more time, gripped it like a club. The first Japanese soldier reached him with a bayonet. McKinney blocked the thrust with the rifle barrel, twisted, grabbed the rifle with both hands and swung it like an axe. The stock connected with the soldier's jaw. Bone shattered, teeth flew. The man went down. The second soldier was right behind. McKinney kicked him in the knee. The joint hyperextended. Ligaments tore. The soldier collapsed. McKinney finished him with the rifle butt to the back of the head. 3 soldiers left. They attacked together, coordinated, professional infantry assault. McKinney fought like a man who had spent his entire life killing to survive, who had learned at age 8 that missing meant starving, who understood at a fundamental level that hesitation meant death. He smashed one soldier's face with the rifle stock. The nose collapsed inward. The soldier dropped. He kicked another in the groin. When the man doubled over, McKinney brought his knee up into the soldier's face. The impact knocked him unconscious. The last soldier lunged with a knife. McKinney grabbed his wrist, twisted. Years of hard farm labor had given him hands like iron. The Japanese soldier's wrist bones ground together. The knife fell. McKinney drove his elbow into the soldier's throat, crushed the windpipe. The soldier collapsed, gasping for air that wouldn't come. At 05:27, the shooting stopped. McKinney stood in the center of the battlefield, covered in blood, his blood, Japanese blood, both mixed together until you couldn't tell the difference. His right ear was nearly severed, hanging by a strip of skin. His uniform was torn and soaked. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. His rifle looked more like a club than a firearm. The stock was cracked, the barrel was bent, the receiver was covered in blood and human tissue. Around him, 41 Japanese soldiers lay dead, some shot, some beaten to death with a rifle, some killed with their own weapons, some killed with bare hands. 41 men in 40 minutes, 1 rifle, 1 soldier, 1 morning in the Philippines that should have ended in massacre, but ended in something else entirely. Company A's commander, Captain Frank Gupton, found McKinney at 05:45. The shooting had stopped. The Japanese attack had been repelled across the entire perimeter. American casualties were light, considering the size of the assault, but the gun position looked like a slaughterhouse. Gupton counted bodies, asked McKinney what had happened. McKinney's account was brief, matter-of-fact, the same way he'd describe a day's hunting back in Georgia. "Came to my tent with a sword. I hit him. Then I went to the gun. They were taking it. I stopped them. Then more came. I stopped them too." Gupton looked at the bodies, looked at McKinney, looked at the destroyed rifle, looked at McKinney's severed ear. "How many did you kill, Private?" McKinney shrugged. "Didn't count, sir. Just shot until they stopped coming." Gupton counted. 41 dead Japanese soldiers. Most of them in and around the machine gun position, all killed by rifle fire, blunt force trauma, or hand-to-hand combat. The ballistic evidence supported McKinney's account. Spent M1 casings littered the ground at exactly the positions he described. 8 round clusters, the signature of a Garand shooter reloading and continuing to fight. The trajectory of wounds on the Japanese bodies matched the firing angles from those positions. Medical examiners would later note that some soldiers had been shot at point-blank range. Others had been beaten to death with extreme force. Several showed defensive wounds consistent with hand-to-hand combat. 1 man, 41 kills, 40 minutes. Gupton didn't believe it. Not fully. Not at first. The numbers were too high. 1 man couldn't kill 40-plus enemy soldiers in less than an hour. But the evidence was undeniable. The bodies were real. The blood was real. McKinney's wounds were real. And every other American soldier who'd been near that machine gun position was either dead, wounded, or evacuated. McKinney was the only one who'd been there for the entire fight. The company medic treated McKinney's ear, cleaned the wound, applied sulfa powder, bandaged it as best he could. The ear would never fully heal. The top portion was gone, cut clean through by a Japanese officer's sword. McKinney refused morphine, said he didn't need it, just wanted water and ammunition in case the Japanese came back. They didn't come back. The attack had broken against Company A's perimeter. Over 100 Japanese soldiers had attacked. More than 60 lay dead across the battlefield. The survivors melted back into the jungle. The 33rd Infantry Division sent an intelligence team to verify the company's casualty report. When they read that a single private had killed 41 enemy soldiers, they assumed it was an exaggeration. Combat reports often inflated enemy casualties. Men under stress made mistakes. Panic led to double counting. Multiple soldiers claimed credit for the same kills. The investigators interviewed McKinney, interviewed witnesses, examined the battlefield, counted the bodies again with methodical precision. Some accounts suggested the actual number of Japanese dead exceeded 100 across the entire perimeter, but only 41 could be directly attributed to McKinney's actions with certainty. The investigators reached an unavoidable conclusion. The report was accurate. Private John McKinney had single-handedly repelled the main thrust of an attack by approximately 100 Japanese soldiers. He had killed 41 of them. He had saved his company from potential annihilation. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor went forward in June 1945. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. Fewer than 3,500 have been awarded since the Civil War. The criteria are specific and demanding. The recipient must have distinguished himself conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. McKinney's actions exceeded those criteria by any reasonable measure. The recommendation moved through channels. War Department reviewers examined the evidence. They found the same thing the division investigators had found. The story was true. Every detail was supported by witness testimony and physical evidence. On January 23, 1946, Private John McKinney stood in the White House. President Harry Truman placed a Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation described his actions in formal military language. He stood his ground and fought desperately against the overwhelming assault, constantly exposing himself to the enemy fire to kill his attackers with rifle fire and hand-to-hand combat. His extraordinary heroism and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. McKinney didn't give a speech. He thanked the president, shook his hand, went back to his hotel. When reporters asked about the battle, he gave the same brief answers he had given Captain Gupton that morning on Luzon. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. Then he stopped talking. He didn't like talking about killing. Didn't see the point. The press called him the Pacific's Audie Murphy. Murphy had received his Medal of Honor for single-handedly holding off German forces in France. McKinney had done something similar against Japanese forces in the Philippines. Both men had faced overwhelming odds. Both had refused to retreat. Both had emerged victorious through a combination of skill, courage, and something that defied easy explanation. But while Murphy became a movie star after the war, McKinney went home to Georgia. He was 25 years old. He had a Medal of Honor, a third-grade education, and a partially severed ear that would never fully heal. The war was over. The killing was done. John McKinney had to figure out how to be a normal person again. John McKinney returned to Scriven County, Georgia, in February 1946. He went back to the only life he knew, the only life he'd ever expected to have, farming, hunting, fishing in the same creeks where he had learned to shoot as a boy. He rarely spoke about the war. His neighbors knew he had received the Medal of Honor. They had seen the newspaper articles. Some had attended the ceremony when he came home. But McKinney never brought it up, never displayed the medal, never wore it, never attended reunions or gave interviews. When people asked about Luzon, about the Japanese, about the 41 men he'd killed, he would say a few words and then change the subject. Did what I had to do, same as everyone else. That was all he would say. The nightmares were a different matter. His family knew about those, the sounds he made in his sleep, the way he would wake suddenly, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. The night terrors came 2 or 3 times a week. He'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, shaking. His wife would hold him until he calmed down. He never talked about what he saw in those dreams. The war had followed him home in ways that no medal could address. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized diagnosis in 1946. The term didn't exist. The concept was barely understood. Soldiers who struggled with combat memories were told to forget about it, move on. Be grateful you survived. Stop dwelling on the past. McKinney did what most veterans of his generation did. He buried the memories, pushed them down, kept working. He married Corinne Wells in 1947. She was a local girl from Sylvania. They built a small house on family land, started a family, had children. McKinney worked various jobs around Screven County, farmhand, timber worker, anything that kept him outside, kept his hands busy. He hunted and fished like he had before the war. But it was different now, less about survival, more about being alone in the woods where things made sense. The years passed. Korea came and went. Vietnam came and went. New wars created new heroes and new veterans with their own buried memories. McKinney remained in Georgia, quietly living, quietly aging. Rarely talking about May 11, 1945. The Medal of Honor sat in a drawer somewhere. He had earned the nation's highest military decoration, and most of his neighbors had no idea. The few who did know treated him with respect, but they also gave him space. There was something in his eyes, something that made people uncomfortable. The look of a man who had killed 41 people in 40 minutes. In 1965, a writer named Forrest Bryant Johnson learned about McKinney's story. Johnson was a veteran himself, Korean War. He understood what combat did to men, how it changed them, how some men carried it better than others. Johnson wanted to document McKinney's story, make sure it wasn't forgotten. He started researching. It was difficult. McKinney didn't want to talk. He'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Why would he dredge it all up for a stranger with a notepad? But Johnson was persistent, patient. He didn't push. He let McKinney talk when he was ready, stayed quiet when he wasn't. Over several years, McKinney opened up. A little, not much, but enough. He talked about growing up in Screven County, about learning to hunt, about joining the army because there was a war and he didn't know what else to do. He talked about the Philippines, the jungle, the heat, the fear that was always there, under everything else. He talked about May 11th, the sword, the machine gun, fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. And he talked about after, about coming home, about trying to be normal when you've done something that's anything but normal. Johnson spent years tracking down other witnesses, found some of the men from Company A, got their accounts of that morning, cross-referenced everything with military records. Many of the witnesses had died, combat, disease, old age. The generation that fought World War II was disappearing. But Johnson pieced together what he could, built a comprehensive picture of what happened, verified every detail that could be verified. His book, Phantom Warrior, was published in 2007. It documented McKinney's childhood in Georgia, his service in the Pacific, and the battle that earned him the Medal of Honor. The book brought renewed attention to a hero most Americans had never heard of. Veterans groups invited McKinney to speak. Schools asked him to talk to students. He declined most invitations. At 87 years old, he wanted to be left alone. Let the book tell the story. That was enough. McKinney did not live to see the book published. He died on April 5, 1997, in Sylvania, Georgia. He was 76 years old, the sharecropper's son who had killed 41 Japanese soldiers with a rifle, and his bare hands passed away quietly. Heart failure. Quick. No suffering. He was buried in Screven County, Scrub Creek Baptist Church Cemetery, not far from the land where he had learned to hunt, where he had learned that missing meant going hungry, where he had learned the skills that would save his life and the lives of every man in Company A. 20 years after his death, Georgia honored him again. In 2017, the state legislature voted to rename a section of highway in Screven County. It became the John R. McKinney Medal of Honor Highway. A ceremony was held. Veterans attended. His children and grandchildren were there. Local officials gave speeches about honor and sacrifice and the debt we owe to those who served. The McKinney family accepted the recognition on behalf of a man who had never sought recognition for what he did. The highway sign stands today. State Route 24 between Sylvania and Oliver. Drivers pass it every day without knowing the story behind the name. They don't know about the tent and the sword. They don't know about the machine gun and the 40 minutes. They don't know that the quiet farmer who once lived nearby had saved an entire company through an act of violence and courage that still defies belief. 41 men in 40 minutes, one rifle, one soldier, one morning in the Philippines that should have ended in massacre, but ended in something else entirely. Private John McKinney never asked to be a hero. He was a farm boy who joined the army because there was a war. He did what he had to do to survive and to protect the men sleeping around him. Then he went home and tried to live a normal life, tried to forget, tried to be the person he was before he learned that he could kill 41 men without running out of determination. He never quite succeeded at forgetting. The nightmares proved that. But he built a life anyway. Married, raised children, worked, hunted, fished, lived quietly in Screven County for another 51 years after the war ended. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is John McKinney, a sharecropper's son with a third-grade education who became one of the most lethal individual soldiers in American military history, who saved his company, who earned the Medal of Honor, who went home and never talked about it. The highway sign will weather and fade. The book will go out of print eventually. The people who remember will die. But the story remains. Carved into the historical record, preserved in military archives, taught in infantry schools as an example of what one determined soldier can accomplish. 41 kills, 40 minutes, one rifle, and the refusal to quit. That's John McKinney's legacy. Not the medal, not the recognition that came decades too late. The legacy is simpler than that. On May 11, 1945, when death came for Company A, with swords and rifles and grenades, one Georgia farm boy said no, and meant it.